This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
About the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center.
Black unemployment is at a 28-year high. And yet it's ironic that as unemployment continues and black folks are dealing with all kinds of struggle around their economic conditions, that the most popular movie in America is a movie about black workers, The Help. Today, to talk about the economy is Professor William Sandy Darity, Chair of African and African American Studies at Duke University, noted economist, Professor of Public Policy here at Duke, and Duchess Harris, Professor of American Studies at Macalester College in Minneapolis, who will talk to us about The Help and her new book on Black women in politics. I'm Mark Anthony Neal, and this is Left of Black. Welcome to Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal, and we're joined this afternoon by William Sandy Darity, Arts and Sciences Professor of Public Policy, Economics, and African American Studies, African and African American Studies at Duke University, also the Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies. How are you doing today, Sandy?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Mark.
I wanted you to come in because, you know, there's been a lot of chatter about the economy, right? You know, that classic political statement, it's the economy, stupid.
Right.
But you have argued that, you know, the Obama administration made a conscious decision about the economic recovery in that it would be a jobless recovery. Yeah. And it seems, you know, 3 years down the road that's very much coming back to bite the administration, you know, with unemployment now, you know, above 9%, and of course much higher. You know,
I always thought that the concept of a jobless recovery is an oxymoron in the first place. And I have thought from the outset of the Great Recession that what was really needed was a direct program of employment. Mm-hmm. That instead of relying on strategies like a stimulus package, which would indirectly create jobs, right, or was hoped to indirectly create jobs, let's go ahead and use federal resources for the purposes of putting people to work directly.
Right.
And so I've been an advocate of a national employment guarantee for all citizens.
About a year ago or so, you were on the Tom Joyner show.
Right,
with Roland Martin.
Yes.
You know,
very briefly.
And I can imagine, you know, because, you know, we're in this interesting kind of moment with all the pundits and talking heads.
Yes.
That very often when we talk about economics in general, right, you will see economists. But when we talk about black economic, you know, experiences,
right,
what you get are humanities professors and social science professors, very few economists.
Right.
And so I can imagine, you know, part of, you know, Roland Martin's stimulus, and I can imagine his people the day before. Let's find a black economist, right? And so the black economist is on the Tom Joyner show, and you talk about this jobs program.
Right.
This guaranteed jobs program. And the first thing that Mr. Joyner says in response is, well, Professor Darity, that sounds like communism.
Right.
And you begin to go through this process of talking about the WPA. Talk about, you know, the kind of things that the Fed has done in the past.
Okay.
Right, to stimulate employment and why you would think that whether it's Obama administration or any other folks in Washington are really hesitant to talk about a recovery in the way that we've created recoveries in the past.
So if you go back to, I mean, the current Great Recession is probably the most severe economic collapse that the United States has experienced since the Great Depression.
Right.
And because of the severity of the Great Depression, a period where I think at the nadir of the economy's performance, 1/4 of the population who was looking for work could not find a job.
Right.
Okay. It was so severe that the response was to take on some programs that were extremely bold in comparison with previous kinds of projects that had been pursued by the federal government. So a couple of those initiatives were the introduction of the Work Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which were initiatives that put people to work primarily on infrastructure building projects.
But also folks working in the arts.
Working in the arts.
Slave, slave
the
stories
collection
were
of the slave narratives.
Right.
People were paid to produce artistic products.
Right.
So there was a real creative and wide-ranging concept
and not a lot of
type
this,
of employment people could be put to.
Right. And a lot of this stuff obviously didn't touch black folks in the 1930s, right? But yet there's a model there.
There is a model there, and the premise behind what I'm proposing now is not a project that's exclusively for black folks.
Right.
It's for anyone who's unemployed to have the option of turning to the federal government to find a job. So my goal is to take the threat of unemployment out of existence.
Yeah.
Okay. And so the 1930s provides us with a precedent or an example. Now, there are some other folks who are advocates of a federal jobs program, but they typically have in mind a program that's targeted at communities with extremely high rates of unemployment, and it would be a program that is temporary. So if the crisis eases, when we move into a period of greater prosperity, then the program would collapse or would be eliminated. I have in mind a permanent job guarantee, and it would operate in the rhetoric that we use in economics as an automatic stabilizer. In the following sense. When we have periods where unemployment is rising rapidly, then more people would turn to the public sector employment opportunity. And then when we have periods that are more prosperous, fewer people would. So the program would expand and contract in response to the general performance of the economy.
You're watching Left of Black, and we're joined by William Sandy Darity, Arts and Sciences Professor of Public Policy, Economics, and African American Studies. Also the chair of the African and African American Studies Department. You were a critic of President Obama when he was still on the campaign trail. Some might describe it as a harsh critic. Have you been surprised at all, one, by his performance through these first 3 years? I mean, and taking into account all the other kind of background chatter that's been associated with the first black president, and have you been surprised at all by the economic choices that he's made, both in terms of who became his initial inner circle, but also the kind of policies that they've pursued?
Well, if President Obama has two attributes that can be both strengths and weaknesses. One is he's highly disciplined, and which is on the face of it a strength. But the companion dimension of that is that discipline is embedded in a high degree of caution. And so I'm actually not surprised. To a large degree, I think President Obama is a bit unusual insofar as what he's done is what he said he would do. Okay.
Right. Despite all the hope rhetoric, right? And the folks that I thought it was always interesting that folks read him as a progressive.
Right.
And it was nothing.
Really was nothing programmatic that he promised to do that really had that kind of label about it. He was honest about the war. He said he was going to draw down the troops in Iraq, and he was going to shift the conflict more heavily toward Afghanistan, which is precisely what he's done. So no, I guess I'm not surprised. I may be a little disappointed that he hasn't been more aggressive and bold in terms of trying to address this major, severe economic crisis we have in the United States.
What about the choice of his advisors? Folks have been very critical of someone like Geithner, who amazingly 3 years later is still in the room, or bringing someone like Larry Summers. Cornel West's critique is, these are the very kind of circle of folks who created the conditions for, at least in terms of Wall Street, the economic collapse in the first place.
Yeah, well, I think no matter what people's judgment is about Cornel West as a critic of the president, on this particular point, he's absolutely correct. I mean, these are individuals who are deeply implicated in the collapse of prices on Wall Street, the home mortgage foreclosure crisis, they're deeply implicated in terms of allowing a policy environment to proceed that would permit those things to happen. And so, yeah, I think on that score, I'm a little bit surprised that those are the folks who he chose. I mean, you know, he could have selected people who were comparably cautious, as he was, but without that baggage.
We're here with William Sandy Darity, as Arts and Sciences Professor of Economics, Public Policy, and African American Studies here at Duke University. One of the things I like about your work, you know, in some ways I think you're not your standard economist.
People have said that.
You know, if you know, scholarship in economics can be thought of as interdisciplinary. I mean, you're very much that. You know, whether you're playing harmonica or on your son Aiden's rap recording. But particularly the research that you've done about around education. The whole acting white thesis. You know, that black kids, you know, don't want to be seen as acting white, so they underperform. But also this idea that if you know, take a gifted curriculum. Right, and give that curriculum, make that curriculum accessible to a wide range of students, not just the gifted students, but in fact, you know, the average student or less than average student, they tend to bring up their performance, right, when there's a level of expectation and challenge associated with the work that they do. Talk a little bit about your scholarship around those areas.
So I work with a collaborator who is the head of the American Association for Gifted Children, a woman named Margaret Gale, and she is a research affiliate with the Research Network on Racial and Ethnic Inequality, which is a research program at Duke that I had. Right. And Margaret has been instrumental in the development of a curriculum that is aimed at providing a gifted quality of education for all students. Now, this is a little bit different from declaring all students gifted and putting them into existing gifted programs. This is a new style of curriculum and instruction that's predicated on challenging students to engage in critical thinking and to be creative, and is not predicated on the view that there is age-appropriate knowledge. So the idea in Project Bright Idea, which Margaret has developed, is that there are age-appropriate ways of teaching, but you can teach children almost any content if you know how to do it. And so the core of Project Bright Idea actually is an emphasis on retraining teachers. To be able to deliver this higher level curriculum to a wide array of kids. And our experience in observing this program in operation in the demonstration sites in North Carolina is that it is associated with a significant change in the performance of children. Thus far, it's been primarily concentrated for students who are at the earliest stage of school, K through 2, but we're now trying to expand that curriculum to the higher grades. But you know, it's fairly remarkable what happens, and what is especially important is teachers come to realize that all of their students can do things that they didn't previously believe they could do.
One of the programs that you oversee through the Social Science Research Institute is a Young Scholars Program. That you've done for the last 3 years.
And your daughter has been
and the idea
a valued participant.
and the idea of taking young black students, young black Latino students, you know, 6th grade to 12th grade, and to introduce them to a world of thinking, you know, of thinking, right? Of a world of living a life of the mind, right? That a bunch of folks have already made a decision that they have no interest in that,
Yeah,
right?
right.
And so the idea that you have young scholars reading established black scholars and reading their work and doing reports and doing projects, around things like income inequality and healthcare inequality. I mean, all these kinds of issues. What has been the reaction to these kinds of programs? I know here in Durham, a few principals have come out to see the program, working on young students with their writing skills, which very often becomes one of the things that makes it difficult for them to make those kind of transitions.
Yeah, so we have had a situation that's evolved where I think more and more people in Durham have come to know about this program. As a consequence, I think we have fairly strong relationships with 3 of the schools in the city, which now routinely will send us students for the summer program. But yeah, the initial idea was to have students get an exposure to research, which is what we do at universities, and to demystify that process and to give them a sense that they can be original researchers themselves. And to teach them some very fundamental things about norms of plagiarism, which are not always followed by students that are older than they are, right? But the way we started this, as you mentioned, was by having the students do work on biographical work on black scholars, where they were responsible for reading at least one paper that had been published by the scholar and provide some critical discussion of what's going on in that paper.
We're here with William Sandy Darity, who's the Arts and Sciences Professor of Public Policy, Economics, and African American Studies. You're also the chair of African American Studies here at Duke, and one of the things we're going to do during the course of this second season of Left of Black is to kind of take the temperature of black studies. It's been around now, 40 plus years. There are still folks, general folks who are wrapping their heads around the idea that there's even something called black studies, let alone whether or not it's something that is of value in the academy. And of course, here at Duke, it's a highly interdisciplinary space, right?
Right.
We have economists, we have anthropologists, cultural anthropologists, we have folks who do popular culture like myself, literary folks, historians.
It's deeply global or international in scope.
Right. Where do you see black studies at this vantage, whether here at some place like Duke, but just generally nationally and internationally?
Well, I think I see black studies as being at the heart of research that can inform us about group identities, how groups that are mutually identified as being different from one another on grounds of race may interact in terms of conflict or collaboration, what the consequences are for inequality that's linked to those group-based identities, what kinds of artistic products are generated from the force of those kinds of conflicts, right? Black studies, in some sense, becomes an avenue for kind of this sounds almost trite, but for studying everything. I mean, one of our faculty members, our new faculty members, Charmaine Royal, is a human geneticist. And so she brings to our community of scholars insights about the Human Genome Project and for the way in which people historically have tried to race classify and what is legitimate and illegitimate about those classification schemes. And she also does some very interesting ethnographic work, which compares people's beliefs or expectations about what their personal family ancestry is against what they learn when they submit their own DNA for
samples,
some
right.
investigation of what
Right.
their ancestry is. To the extent that you can trust those kinds of.
I mean, so to work
Right.
with someone like Isaiah Washington, right?
Yes,
Right.
yeah,
Who
yeah.
claims a direct, African, ancestry because he went through this process.
right.
Rick Kittles and,
Right.
and those folks up in
Right.
Chicago.
And then, so what are the consequences of what you learn?
Right.
And how does that change your life, or does it at all?
Right.
Yeah. So Black studies now, I think, sort of spans the domain from the laboratory sciences to critical theory and the humanities. And we just had a conference that was co-sponsored by the department that was called The Social Determinants of Health Disparities.
Right.
So that engaged an array of scholars who were working on health inequality issues from the fields of epidemiology, maternal and child health, medicine, as well as the various social sciences. And I think that's squarely a subject matter in Black studies also.
And it really highlights the way that, work around those kind of issues ultimately can make medicine, right, as a field, much more responsive.
Yes, we hope.
Right,
Yeah,
in the best case
that's
scenario, right?
That's
And I think
that's
people miss that kind of dynamic about Black studies, right?
Yeah.
In the same way that the civil rights movement didn't just help Black folks.
Right.
Right,
Right.
that research around Black studies really does, reach well beyond the experiences of Black folks.
Yeah, I mean, my concern about the high incidence of unemployment
Right.
was in large measure prompted by the fact that the Black rate of unemployment consistently is twice as high as the white rate of unemployment. And I've long said that this, to me, is a prime index of the degree of discrimination in the society.
Absolutely.
But when the white rate of unemployment
It's
approaches
as high as 10%.
8 to 10%,
Right.
then it's a crisis for everyone.
Right.
And solutions that we may come up with that we initially might think would be beneficial to Black Americans potentially then become beneficial to everyone. Yeah.
You've been watching Left of Black, and we've been joined this afternoon by William Sandy Darity, who's the Arts and Sciences Professor of Public Policy, Economics, and African American Studies. Do you have enough hats, Sandy?
I have enough hats.
and also Chair of the Department of African American Studies, and a fine harmonica player, I might add.
I want to thank you again for having the link to my son Aiden's song "Post-Racial America"
yes.
on your site, and my other son is playing guitar on the piece. So it's a bit of a family affair.
Yes.
So, okay.
Thanks for joining us, Sandy.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, I actually saw it twice. I loved the movie. I think it did a really good job. Most of the time when I see movies that were based off of books, I don't like them, but I think it actually did the book justice.
I thought it was a pretty good movie. It's just amazing how, in the workforce, how people treat you, and, everybody has feelings. And, people just don't take, your feelings into consideration, and they help you.
I do. I'm from Nashville, Tennessee, and I actually had a help of my own, and I thought it was pretty representative of what we went through together.
Welcome to Left of Black, and I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We are joined today by Professor Duchess Harris, Associate Professor of American Studies at Macalester College in Minneapolis, author of Black Feminist Politics, From Kennedy to Clinton, just released in paperback, and also the co-editor with Bruce Baum of Racially Writing the Republic, Racists, Race Rebels, and Transformations of American Identity. How are you doing today, Duchess?
I'm doing great, Mark. Thanks for having me on.
How's everything in Minneapolis?
Things are doing fine. We haven't been hit by an earthquake.
And let me start by asking you this question. You're one of those folks who have a very unique scholarly profile in both, that you both have a PhD and also a JD. What has been really the productive benefit of having these two degrees in terms of the kind of work that you do?
Well, I've always been interested in critical race theory, inspired by Kim Crenshaw and Adrienne Ring and Cheryl Harris. And so I just finished law school in January.
Congratulations.
In 6 weeks, yeah, very excited. And 6 weeks after I graduated, they asked me to become an adjunct, and I recently finished teaching a class on race and the law.
Okay. Your latest book, Black Feminist Politics from Kennedy to Clinton, was released in paperback earlier in the spring. I want to talk a few things about the book because the book really gives us a very interesting kind of framework of African American feminism, but not just in the context of thinking about it within feminist thought, but in actual relationship to American politics. You begin the book by talking about the development of things like President Kennedy's President's Commission on the Status of Women. The National Organization of Women is born out of that commission, and there are only a few black women who were involved, notably Shirley Chisholm and Pauli Murray. Can you talk about the role that these two particular black women played in the early days of the National Organization of Women?
Sure. I mean, I'll start off with the Kennedy Commission because that was so important because John F. Kennedy was the first president to ask the opinions of black women. And so he set up this commission, which had 11 committees and 4 consultations. And the 4th one was called Problems of Negro Women. And it was chaired by Dorothy Height. And so the commission met between 61 and 63. And the great thing about it was that they were even asked what they thought. And they came up with wonderful findings. This was the place where you have the initial thoughts that there should be something similar to AFDC. The downside of this was that when all of the findings of the larger commission were printed and they were put in the New York Times, none of the suggestions for the black women were included.
Right.
So no one knew what Dorothy Height and the women that she was working with were interested in. And so it was shortly after that, 3 years after that, that you got black women interested in both the National Organization for Women and the Panther Party.
Can you talk a little bit about what you might think would have been, President Kennedy's stimulus for wanting to include a conversation about what black women were thinking about?
I think it was well-intentioned. This wasn't the first time that there was a president that had black women near his cabinet. Part of it is that the commission was chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, and she passed away in '62. And so she was pivotal in trying to extend herself to black women. But it's very similar to other policy situations that we see now, which is just that you make an attempt, but the country isn't ready for you to go as far as you need to go.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We're here with Professor Duchess Harris, author of Black Feminist Politics from Kennedy to Clinton, and Obama, I guess, also within this context in the paperback edition at least. One of the things that comes out of the President's Commission on Women's Issues and also the founding of NOW is the creation of the National Black Feminist Organization. And in your description of this organization, which is founded again in the 1970s, it's kind of now meets the Black Panther Party.
Exactly.
Talk a little bit about how important this particular organization was.
This organization was so important because a lot of black women who were involved in either the National Organization for Women or the Panther Party felt that their needs weren't being met. And for instance, one of the main issues that provided a dilemma for black women was birth control. And so the National Organization for Women was a huge advocate for getting the pill to be approved by the FDA. And then the Panther Party was concerned that birth control was really a form of genocide, a way of holding black women back. And so black women decided they needed to find a way to voice their own concerns. And so that's just one way in which they felt that race and gender needed to be simultaneously addressed.
In the backdrop of this political organizing, of course, Shirley Chisholm runs for president in 1972. Can you talk a little bit about what kind of impact her choice to run for president has on these feminist organizations as they're thinking about the quality of life for black women in the future, but also their impact on national politics?
It had an extraordinary impact. And one of the reasons why it had an impact is because the face of feminism had been white women. I think that there's a new documentary out about Gloria Steinem, and I think that when people think about feminism, they think about middle class white women who were probably in their late 20s at that time. Whereas Shirley Chisholm comes along as this Caribbean immigrant, darker skinned Black woman who is a New Yorker and who also is married to a Black man and says feminism can be for us also. And that just exploded things.
Yeah. You're watching Left to Black. We're joined by Professor Duchess Harris of Macalester College in Minneapolis, author of the new book, Black Feminist Politics from Kennedy to Clinton, and also the co-editor of Racially Writing the Republic. There are some tensions within the National Black Feminist Organization in terms of direction and impact. And there's a particular cohort in the city of Boston that becomes particularly radicalized. Women like Barbara Smith, Cheryl Clark, and they had decided at some point to break off and create what we all recognize now, at least in terms of contemporary Black feminist thought, as one of the most important organizations, the Combahee River Collective. Can you talk about the tensions within the early organization that leads to the creation of the Combahee Collective, and also talk about what the women at the collective were working for, particularly in the context of these retreats that they held in 1977, 1978, and 1979?
Definitely. One of the women that was involved in the National Black Feminist Organization was Michelle Wallace. And Michelle Wallace has said that one of the reasons why the National Black Feminist Organization struggled, and it only was active for about 6 years, was because you're talking about young, single, straight Black women who felt a conflict around organizing around feminism and not being able to negotiate that with patriarchy in the Black community. What was fantastic about Barbara Smith and Cheryl Clark and these women is that they said, we don't have this issue because we're lesbians, and we are not going to spend our time wasting it with being worried about if someone's going to ask us out on a date. So we're going to do our own grassroots organizing, and we can add queer identity into this. And not only that, they had a Marxist analysis. And so really the Combahee River Collective Statement, which now is on syllabi in certain women's and gender studies courses, that says that, you know, it is about eradicating the oppression of all. And they talked about the simultaneity of oppression, and they talked about identity politics. And Barbara Smith argues that they were the first one to coin the phrase identity politics.
One of the things that you talk about in the book, you know, as they're thinking about a name for the organization, you know, Barbara Smith, you know, suggested she wanted to find a name that was really rooted in Black women's achievement. Talk about the inspiration for the name Combahee River Collective.
Sure. Where she gets it from is that they argue that Harriet Tubman is the first American woman to lead troops in battle. And Harriet Tubman crosses enslaved Africans through the Combahee River, which is in South Carolina, so that they would lose their scent, so that they would not be caught by the dogs. And Barbara Smith was geographically located in Boston, and she said she wanted to make sure that Northern Blacks did not lose this story.
The late 1970s, in some ways, are a very heady time for Black feminist thought. Michelle Wallace, of course, publishes her book in 1978. Alice Walker's In Search of Our Mother's Gardens is published in 1975. But then, of course, in 1980, Ronald Reagan is elected. And not only do we see a retreat, you know, from civil rights politics and civil rights achievement, we also see a retreat, obviously, in terms of women's issues, but particularly Black women's issues. And one of the things, the figures who's always traveled with Ronald Reagan, dating back to his initial running for the president, is this figure of the welfare queen. And the welfare queen becomes the primary way that Black women are introduced into national politics in the 1980s. Can you talk a little bit about these dynamics?
I mean, I really appreciate you bringing this up, because when Reagan recently would have had his 100th birthday, he was celebrated. When he passed away, he was celebrated. And it's very dicey talking about someone who is no longer with us. However, I feel that we have to know that we wouldn't even have the terminology welfare queen if it weren't for former President Reagan.
Right.
And he evokes this black woman in Chicago whose name was Linda Taylor. And he tells the story on his campaign trail, both in 80 and 84, that she had cheated the government of $150,000. When the truth of the matter was she had actually had fraud at the total of $8,000. And clearly, I'm not an advocate for fraud. But as we are in this political moment right now, this economic moment where people are struggling, I think many people can understand how one might end up in a situation where they might illegally be using food stamps, for instance.
Yeah. And it's ironic because given the way that, you know, black folks have often closed ranks around Bill Clinton, you know, Bill Clinton essentially used the specter of the welfare queen to push welfare reform in the 1990s, you know, that was to the detriment in some cases of working families across the board, but obviously African-American working families.
I mean, completely to the detriment to working families. But when you talk about how it's racialized, one of the things that's disturbing about Clinton is even the image that goes along with signing the bill. If people were to look up the photograph that was ran in all of the newspapers and that still comes up when you talk about Clinton's welfare bill, sitting next to him as he is signing the bill is a morbidly obese black woman. Yeah. And that is our image of who is the recipient of welfare. And because I live in the Midwest, where our Democratic Party is actually referred to as DFL, which is Democratic Farmer Labor, it really are lots of Midwestern farming white people are the people that have benefited from welfare, not inner city black people.
And I mean, you present those great numbers in the book that if you look at the welfare rolls in the 1930s, you know, where the percentage of whites are around 30%, but it's actually by the early 1970s, and not only is it above 40%, but they are in fact the majority of the people on the welfare rolls.
And probably will be for a very long time.
Yeah, hell of a lot of white folks in the country.
There you go. And you know, most of us aren't doing that well right now.
Right, absolutely. One of the things that I loved about the book, and you're watching Left to Black, and we're talking with Professor Miriam Harris, author of the new book, now out in paperback, Black Feminist Politics from Kennedy to Clinton, with a chapter on Obama. The way that you integrate, particularly in the context of the 1980s, you know, we talked about Ronald Reagan and the welfare queen and the way that he used that to push certain notions of domestic policy. But you also argue in the 1980s that this is occurring also within the realm of popular culture, and I would argue in a way that was unprecedented. So on the one hand, you have the welfare queen, but then you have the first Miss Black America, yes. Vanessa Williams, and the way her choices as a teenager, you know, also impact the way that we politically see the viability of black women in national politics in the 1980s.
Yes. Well, I talk about her being the fallen beauty queen. And Vanessa Williams has made a comeback that's unprecedented. She actually is the most highly successful Miss America we've ever had.
And it's a generation of folks who have no knowledge of this previous history of her, you know, going back.
Exactly. I mean, our incoming first-year students, I think, are born in 1993.
Right.
And so she lost her crown in 84, I believe it was. And so this completely predates them. And the problem is that Vanessa Williams was exploited by Penthouse magazine in the 11th month of her having the crown. And she had taken some nude photos, which actually I would argue were erotic and not necessarily pornographic. And there is a distinction. And because of that, she lost her crown. This is difficult to teach to undergrads in a culture where young women like Lindsay Lohan have a difficult time remembering to put their underwear on. And so people think now, what's the big deal? But in the moment of Reagan, it was an extraordinarily big deal. And so I talk about how we move from the welfare queen to this fallen beauty queen, and then you have the quota queen with Lani Guinier that is done by Clinton, and then of course, unfortunately, you have the condom queen, which is how Dr. Joycelyn Elders was treated.
And you mentioned these figures from the Reagan era. Again, there's a narrative that talks about how much of a friend, you know, Bill Clinton was to the black population, to black voters, black communities. And of course, he clearly always understood how to invoke a certain kind of rhetoric
within the context of Black church traditions, et cetera.
Sure.
But when you look at, the number of Black women who were fairly prominent during the Clinton era, and the way that they were framed, you mentioned Jocelyn Elders, Dr. Jocelyn Elders, you mentioned, Lonnie Guinier. We could also bring Carol Moseley Braun,
definitely,
into the mix. And of course, predating Clinton's election, the spectacle that was the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearings, of course, celebrating 20-year anniversary this fall. Talk about how Black womanhood circulates within national politics in the 1990s.
I mean, it's a very difficult time. And for me, it was a coming of age time. As you talk about the 20th anniversary coming up, that was the year that I started graduate school.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to graduate school with the understanding that I'm going to be a faculty member. And I was always interested in law, but I knew I didn't want to necessarily be a full-time law professor like Professor Hill. And I'm not conservative like Professor Hill. But I was deeply concerned about how her body was on display and how she was not believed. And one of the things that I was thinking about also is that this really had global coverage, which doesn't mean much now in 2011, but at the time that you could be in another country and see this Yale-educated law professor so abused, and having members of the United States Senate ask her about pubic hair, ask her to talk about Long John Silver. I mean, it was atrocious. And actually, Vice President Biden was complicit in it.
Yes, absolutely. I think he would like to forget that himself. I mean, lots of folks, right? Ted Kennedy, I mean, a range of folks who were part of grilling her, at that particular point in time, that, their motivations, of course, were incredibly questionable. The thing that's so interesting about, say, Dr. Jocelyn Elders or Lonnie Guinier or Anita Hill is that, you compare how they were treated within this context in comparison to what really was the high point of several African-American men in terms of national politics, right? This is Colin Powell's rise to fame.
Sure.
In popular culture, you're looking at the high point of the Michael Jordans and the Michael Jacksons and Mike Tyson, at least in the earlier part of the decade. And so on the one hand, you have the concerns of African-American men being highlighted in certain kinds of ways. At the same time, the reputations of Black women are being damaged. We go forward, to 2008, and of course the election of President Barack Obama, and there's several African-American women, who become also very prominent in his rise of political power. I'm thinking specifically of Susan Rice, who's ambassador to the UN, Desiree Rogers, who briefly, is the White House planner, for lack of a better way to describe it, Lisa Jackson, of course, with the EPA, and then of course Valerie Jarrett, who is one of his primary advisors. But then we have the story of Shirley Sherrod. Talk a little bit about how Barack Obama handled the Shirley Sherrod situation, and perhaps might have been handled a little different if she was instead an African-American, African-American male working within that context instead of a Black woman.
The Shirley Sherrod situation is complicated by the fact of who his advisors are.
Yeah.
I mean, I am sympathetic to the fact that domestic issues often take a backseat when you are in Iraq, you are in Afghanistan, and this also happened before he got Osama bin Laden. And so, his primary concern is foreign policy. However, I don't understand why the Valerie Jarretts of the world and the other people who should have more of a handle on what's happening, right here in the United States, weren't familiar with the Sherrod last name.
Right.
The Sherrod last name is legendary in civil rights. And so it makes me call to question what is the familiarity and what is the priority of domestic civil rights.
Do you think that ultimately impacts how he deals with Black issues in general? Given the cast of folks who are very close to him and his advisors. I mean, there's an argument that says that, in some ways the Black folks that he has around him are really Black folks like him. Black folks who aren't necessarily on the ground in certain kind of ways. So it becomes important to have figures like Al Sharpton as a stand-in, to be able to speak to those policies in ways that his advisors can't.
I think it would be much easier for a white president to have someone managing race relations.
That's ironically, right?
He doesn't have that. He has a black attorney general, and he has some prominent people in his cabinet, but that doesn't mean that these issues are being dealt with.
And it, you know, what's interesting, in some ways, George Bush used the same strategy by having a black National Security Council member head in terms of Dr. Condoleezza Rice, and having a black Secretary of State in Colin Powell. In some ways, he never had to respond to black issues, but that was almost an expectation anyway. So in some ways, he didn't get pushed on that. Obama, because he's the black president, of course, gets pushed in a certain kind of way, even in some ways, if he's following the same kind of strategy that George Bush followed, you know, before him.
Sure. I mean, we have a much higher standard for him.
Expectations, yeah.
I mean, exactly. And, you know, we could talk about if it's fair or if it isn't fair, but it just is what it is. And also, I think the black community feels that they went above and beyond the duty to elect him, and that they want a certain level of accountability. And when I use the word accountability, it brings us full circle back to Shirley Chisholm, where Dr. Julianne Malveaux and some other people decided that there should be a Shirley Chisholm Presidential Accountability Commission.
You're watching Left of Black. We're here with Professor Duchess Harris of Macalester College in Minneapolis, author of the new book, now out on paper book, Black Feminist Politics from Kennedy to Clinton. So unemployment is above 9%. Gaddafi is about to fall in Libya. We still have wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but yet everybody wants to talk about Catherine Sackett's book and film adaptation, The Help. You know, very briefly, could you talk a little bit about, you know, your feelings about the book and whether or not you have at this point in time, you know, seen the film? And has the conversation surprised you at all?
Actually, the conversation has not surprised me. The first thing that brought my attention to the book is learning that Aileen Cooper was suing Catherine Stockett. And so that piqued my interest about the book. And I actually approached the book with an open mind. I purchased it. I read it cover to cover twice. And what I found when I read the book was that it was less than I actually had expected. I was thinking that it was going to be an extremely well-written book, given the fact that it has sold 5 million copies. And I thought that might be one of the reasons why she was being sued, because the story had at least been appropriated well. I think the story has been appropriated. I also don't think that she did a spectacular job.
And so are you going to go see the film, or are you going to pass on that? You did a wonderful piece for the Feminist Wire, a wonderful website that focuses really on African-American feminist issues. And, you know, it's an interesting tape in that, you know, you're one of the few people, I think, who have commented on the film, you know, who've actually spent some time with the book. You know, we're in that interesting dynamic.
I actually just commented on the book. I didn't comment on the film because I haven't seen the film. And I just wanted to put that distinction out there. The reason why I feel conflicted about seeing the film is because the first weekend that it was out, it came out second. And now this past weekend, it came out first. And so Aileen Cooper was suing for $75,000. Earlier this week, the judge threw the case out because he said that the statute of limitations had been found. And so it had been exceeded, and she did not have a case. And so she wanted $75,000. In 2 weeks, this film has not only made $50 million, I'd like to say that Emeril Lagasse has a line of cookware affiliated with The Help. Home Shopping Network has 2 pages.
I saw that.
Where you can buy the clothing that the white Southern women wore in the movie, but the black women only wore maids' outfits unless they were at church. And I went into the grocery store, and the Republic of Tea is selling Help Tea for $9.99, which I didn't know that tea was worth $10 of any sort.
Wow.
And so I have an economic problem with The Help. And I have nothing disparaging to say about Viola Davis. I have nothing disparaging to say about Mary J. Blige. or any of the Black women that had, anything to do with this movie. I understand that it is complicated, and in many ways, it's not about them.
I mean, that's amazing that, that she's just asking for $75,000. I mean, anybody involved with the film literally could have just wrote her a check.
Catherine Stockett should have settled out of court
Long ago,
and
right.
have felt grateful.
Right.
That is what she should have done. And she has gone on record as even saying that her own maid couldn't get through the book.
You've been watching Left of Black. We've been joined this afternoon by Professor Duchess Harris, who teaches Professor of American Studies at Macalester College, the author of Black Feminist Politics from Kennedy to Clinton, just out on paperback, and of course the co-editor of Racially Writing Republic, Racist, Race Rebels, and Transformations in American Identity. Thanks for joining us this afternoon, Duchess.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you so much, Mark Anthony Neal.
Take care.
All righty.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.